Been thinking about a vacation trip to the Pacific Northwest? Well, those are just a few of the sounds of this big country. And at Pacific Northwest Bell, we think sounds are about the best way of communicating there is. So we've assembled a collection of typical sounds of the Pacific Northwest. Now sit back and listen. Then come
Hey
look.
VC, Kimbo here, Kimbo's Vinyl Addiction. How's everybody doing out there? I've seen tons of videos, tons of great videos, so thanks to everybody out in the VC for putting out some great content to get us through these times. Hey, I wanted to do a spin on Seattle bands. Mazzy did one on San Francisco bands and some LA bands, and Queensryche did similar, some LA bands and San Francisco bands, and Rob over in Manchester did one on Manchester bands, and Steve on Birmingham bands, and I probably have missed a whole bunch of people. Logan did one on San Francisco bands also, I believe. So anyways, wanted to bring you one on Seattle bands. I'm probably missing several, but these are mostly ones that I have vinyl on. I'm going to go a little bit in just kind of chronological order. And so starting around 1960 and going up through present day, about 25 bands, give or take. So let's get started. So starting out right around 1960 with the Sonics. Now this is kind of a later 85 release compilation of the Sonics, but the Sonics started in 1960, put out their first album around 64, 65, but these guys are pretty heavy for that time frame. If you think of MC5 and the Stooges, kind of music along those lines, and really ahead of their time, really some early forefathers of punk and grunge type music. And okay, next up, I have the Fabulous Wailers. These guys started around 1959 out of the Seattle area. These guys are kind of saxophone driven, early rock type stuff. Put out like 5 or 6 albums. Really good stuff, early stuff. That was their first album. This is their second album, Wailers at the Castle. Now the Castle was a spot in between Seattle and Tacoma in what they call the Midway area. It was actually called the Spanish Castle. And this was an album they did live there, and I'll come back to that. These are a few more Wailers albums that came on. But the Spanish Castle was really an important place in Seattle music history. Started in 1930, went through 1968, but kind of gained prominence in the late 50s as swing dancing kind of went out of fashion, and the crowd started kind of disappearing from there. There was a legendary Seattle DJ producer named Pat O'Day, who talked to the managers, the owners there, and said, hey, can I start bringing in some rock bands? And so he started in 1959, started bringing in rock bands through 1968, brought in the Wailers, the Sonics, the Beach Boys, Roy Orbison, all kinds of acts that went through the place in the early 60s. But the reason I bring that up is in the time frame from 1959 to 1961, there was a guy who would play guitar and show up a lot at the Castle, and he would always ask, especially the local bands, if he could sit in and play guitar with them in their shows. And that person's name was Jimi Hendrix, who was a regular fixture at the Castle between 59 and 61. So a little background on Jimmy, which most of you probably know. Hung out at the Castle, played guitar locally here, 59 to 61, then joined the Army in 61, was discharged a year later, moved to Clarksville, Tennessee, hung out, played around that area with Little Richard and others in the southeast area for a few years. And then in 1966, met the bass player for the Animals. And he promoted Jimmy real big over in England for a year. And he had a few hit singles over there. And then kind of didn't reach prominence in America until he played the Monterey Pop Festival in 67 and then released this album in 67, Are You Experience? So there's Jimi Hendrix, and then I don't know, I'll show his smash hits. I like that cover also. So moving, fast forwarding a little bit into the 70s, the next band, Hart, who was started by Roger Fisher around 1970. He had some different band names, White Hart and Army. But then in 1974, he met up with the Wilson sisters. And in, let's see here, around 74, they were up in Vancouver, Canada. They had Roger Fisher and his brothers. Some of them had moved up there to avoid the draft. And they followed them up there. They started putting together a record on Mushroom Records, what would later become Mushroom Studios. And they recorded and released this album. It sold about 30,000 copies up in Canada at first, but then when they moved it, distributed in the US, it went crazy and sold millions of copies. Ann and Nancy kind of objected to their the picture here with their bare shoulders, and there was ads that Mushroom Records put out talking about showing this picture and saying it was our first time and blah, blah, blah. And they didn't like the way they were marketed through Mushroom Records. So they began disassociating themselves with Mushroom Records up there and signed on with CBS Portrait Records after that, and put out, of course, several albums with them at that point in time. Dog and Butterfly and Magazine. Okay. Next band I wanted to talk about, kind of also 70s, early 80s, was a band called Rael. These guys were kind of just straight rock, kind of in the Van Halen type realm. In fact, starting around 1980, in the early 80s, they toured a lot, opening act for Van Halen. Very popular in the Seattle area, rock band. They also toured with, let me check my notes here, several people. Ted Nugent, ZZ Top, lots of bands at this time. This is their third album. I don't have their first two. But anyways, Rael. Next band is Queensryche. These guys were formed out of Bellevue, Washington, just across the bridge from Seattle. This first album, I believe, was 93. 1983. Their first EP, which was real popular locally and pretty popular with heavy metal rockers. Their second album, Warning, came out a year later. But what really put them over the top was the Operation Mindcrime, I think, really brought them to mainstream popularity. Okay, the next band here is called The Heats. I don't know if these guys got too popular outside the Seattle area, but real popular here. Kind of a new wave alt rock band that played a lot of shows in the Northwest area. That good stuff. Oops, I can't put that there. Okay, and the next band here is the Young Fresh Fellows. These guys formed about 1981, put this album out in 1984. They're kind of a alt rock, pop rock type band from the area. So that's their first album. They also 2 years later put out this one, Topsy Turvy. Okay, the next band I have, if you travel about an hour south of Seattle, And I guess I should have prefaced this up at front, but these are what I call Northwest bands, not all directly out of Seattle, but an hour south of Seattle, a band out of Olympia, Washington, Beat Happening, started by Calvin Johnson, who actually at the same time, he started K Records out of Olympia at this time and put their first album out on K Records. This is a later release, but it was this same cover. It just got re-released with some other material on it in the 90s. But there's the K for K Records. Oops, upside down. Started by Calvin Johnson, and Calvin's still doing projects, still recording bands today. In fact, one of his own personal project called Selector Dub Narcotic, kind of an interesting group, and if you get a chance, check out some. Okay, so moving on to the next band, the U-Men. Let's see, these guys formed around 1980. These guys were kind of a early grunge forefathers, kind of punk, kind of grunge, kind of alt rock type guys. Early forerunners to the grunge scene, but only put out one full-length album. This was it here in the mid 80s. Okay. Hey guys, that's the end of part one. The video got too long, so I had to break it up into some pieces. So stay tuned tomorrow for part two, the grunge years, and then I'll do a part three, the post-grunge years. Thanks for watching. Enjoy your Seattle music, and we'll talk to you later. Bye.
Thank you very much for waiting this long. But to keep on going on with, wait, 1, 2, 3, 4. There. Oh, wrong count. Wait a minute. What's wrong? There. I'll never forget that. But to do a thing that was recorded in 1733 in the Benjamin Franklin Studios, a thing called Spanish Castle Magic. With the best grade, though. Best grade. Same, you know it's a groovy name, and the wind's just right.